Alright guys, listen up. Say what you want about our friend Mr. Dio, but when a flamboyant time-stopping vampire with an invisible friend tells you to subscribe to the New World Review for regular JoJo content uploaded straight into your YouTube feed, then I, personally, think that you should just probably acquiesce and do it. Hello and welcome to the New World Review, your source for everything anime and manga, and today we are here to tackle the topic of a man who is much larger than life itself, the notorious and legendary Dio of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. Now at this stage it is pretty undeniable that Dio is what I would call a flag bearer of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, more so than any of our actual JoJo protagonists. I mean, for example, when I was an outsider looking in on the madness that was JoJo, I could not name a single protagonist. All I really knew was that there was some cool looking dude with a hat. You know whose name I did know? Dio. I had never watched or read JoJo, but this character had already somehow carved out some space for himself in my life, as if he had transcended the very pages he was drawn on, and to quite a large degree, I do believe that is true. Dio is a very rare existence in fiction who has been elevated to a position far beyond anything his actions in JoJo could possibly live up to. And for an awfully long time, as I was diligently working my way through the series, I asked myself on several occasions, what is so appealing about Dio? Because I am in on all of this now, so I should get it, right? And for an awfully long time, I just didn't. It only really properly hit me after I'd finished what was available of Part 8, and I looked back on the series as a whole and realized, right, that's the appeal of Dio. Because the very interesting thing for me is that looking back at Dio's actions and varied roles in the story, none of them are wildly impressive on their own, but as a whole they are held together by the very simple and alluring factor of personality. That is quite literally the only thing that I believe Dio has going for him in JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, but as it turns out, that would be more than enough. But even then, that took time. It took me specifically quite a lot of time, actually. So stepping into the genesis of JoJo, as I often do, Phantom Blood does need to come up in conversation here, because after having this presence that is Dio imprinted on my life through various bombardments of meme culture, I was expecting big things from him here, and he just did not deliver. Dio is a guy who I found to be a bit of a dick for the sake of being a bit of a dick, and I do accept that there is a lot more to that, which is made very clear in Aoki's book, entitled Manga in Theory and Practice. And in regards to Part 1 Dio, he says the following. In Dio's case, I depicted him as coming from an unfortunate upbringing, saddled with a father who had no redeeming qualities whatsoever. I gave him a background that could explain his hunger for power and his willingness to become evil incarnate to obtain it. And the ideas are definitely there, I can't argue that. I just don't personally feel that that intention was quite as effective as Aoki may have intended. So for example, there are certain aspects of Part 1 Dio that I can get on board with, like poisoning both Dario and George, because those were evil acts committed for the sake of raw ambition, and it does further his status. But then there's also a massive aspect of Dio being cruel for the sake of being cruel, like the really vicious way in which he killed Danny, and the moment in which he rejects humanity by embracing the stone mask is very much the point of no return for me in Part 1. From then onwards, Dio is indistinguishable from a generic demon, albeit much more flamboyant. I found it very difficult to connect with him, and I guess that's because of his pure rejection of humanity, and as a result I couldn't form that empathetic link with him that I managed to achieve with almost every other major antagonist from Part 4 onwards, because they all have very strongly human identifying features. But Dio rejected all of that, and as such he became a very flat villainous existence, something that, to be fair, I would later realize would work to his advantage, but for now I wanted more, a lot more, and Part 1 did not give it to me. So let's now cut to Part 3, where I discover that Dio is once again going to play the role of main antagonist, and this has me initially quite excited, because I thought to myself, well, Part 1 was just an aberration, and this must be where the true love for Dio comes from. And so I waited patiently for like 45 episodes for him to eventually take the stage, and while he was significantly more of a presence than in Phantom Blood, and yes, the world is fantastic, Dio didn't actually offer anything new to me. He still felt really flat in terms of almost everything, and it was as if there was nothing more to his existence than simply being a pain in the collective asses of every Joestar family member. And this is where he meets his end, so I was left quite initially unsatisfied by Dio, especially in comparison to a character like Yoshikage Kira, who would immediately follow him up in Part 4, and therefore always draws my direct comparison. But Kira presented an incredible degree of depth and subtlety. He was the exact opposite kind of antagonist to Dio, and that's the sort of thing that I generally personally prefer, but it would eventually lead me to reassessing Dio's role in the series, because I don't think I ever stopped to appreciate what he actually was in my relentless quest for just wanting more of him. And what Dio is a cartoon villain. He does not exist to explore the dark ideas of humanity, or to present himself as sympathetic or an empathetic presence. Dio is designed with a very clear technical narrative purpose, to serve as a thing to be defeated, and to be as entertaining as possible whilst doing it. And so it's a bit bizarre, because on paper there should be nothing redeeming about Dio. In terms of personality, he doesn't really present anything we can identify with. He's an almost purely demonic presence removed from humanity itself, and in addition to that, once again on paper, there should be nothing nothing that redeems him from a storytelling standpoint, because apart from the very early days of Phantom Blood, and acting as a thing to be defeated in Part 3, Dio has no incredible effect on the story. And just to note here, this is my impression before we get to Part 6. But for the rest of Part 1, Dio just sits and waits for Jonathan, and then in Part 3, he sits and waits for Jotaro and Joseph. And yet with these two heavily detrimental features, Dio is somehow still so damn undeniably charming and memorable. This should not be the case. In theory, he should quite possibly be considered the worst villain in the series, although then again, Kaz does exist, so let's put that thought to rest. But Dio shines entirely through personality. Even if he is the polar opposite of everything that humanity holds up and disgusts you with every single action he commits, there is something disturbingly admirable about him. And I put a lot of that down to Dio having an uncompromising personality. As humans, we are very fragile creatures in general, and an awful lot of us second guess pretty much every decision we are faced with. And as a result, the people we look up to are the ones that are able to overcome that and see clearly, or at the very least exude a sense of confidence in what they're doing. So when we're faced with a character like Dio, there is almost no choice but to admire him to some degree, because he at no stage comes to question himself. Dio is supremely confident in his actions, and combined with the various powers and strength he gathers, this results in the sculpting of an individual who can very much be seen as one who has transcended the cesspool of humanity. And Araki often depicts him in this manner, particularly in Part 3, where he is often drawn posing like a statue of some sort of mythical figure, which does make him larger than life itself. And to counter the argument I made about Dio only having a handful of episodes to actually do anything in Stardust Crusaders, with this context in mind, that was probably for the best. The more time Dio spends on a page or on screen, the more that mythical sheen would evaporate, because every moment he spends with us can only serve to humanize this figure more. And in this case, we don't necessarily want that. He needed to maintain an aura of mystery and have our imaginations do the heavy lifting in regards to propping him up as the ultimate enemy, which is achieved very well through the glimpses we get of him in Part 3. Whereas if we did experience a lot of Dio, then by the time we did eventually get to facing off against him, he would not seem anywhere near the almost godlike being that Araki had cast him as. Now, I'm not saying that this was 100% intentional, because Stardust Crusaders has very frustrating storytelling issues, being a very basic creation that waffles around for 90% of its lifespan and then concludes. However, really strangely enough, I believe that Dio was used pretty damn perfectly within this framework. And I also think that I see Part 3 in a different light due to having further context from other parts to work with, specifically Part 6, which looks back on Dio's character and does offer a different perspective on him to the one we were given in Parts 1 and 3. And without going into spoilers for Stone Ocean, this is much more what I was looking for with Dio, and it succeeded in granting him the depth I crave so much, which of course has given me a very favorable retrospective opinion of Mr. Dio. But even with what we have in Dio's prime period of relevance, it's harder to complain about what he is. I mean, yes, he's completely detestable in every way, but he's a villain, and I guess that's very much what a villain is designed to do. We can't all be Yoshikage Kiras, plus Dio's brand of evil is also quite unique, because if he was to be put into the alignment system looking at the ideas of, lawful evil, neutral evil, and chaotic evil, he doesn't quite fit any of them. And I would offer that we place Dio within his own category of flamboyant evil, a brand of sickening evil that is applied with style and flair, thus making it somewhat enjoyable to watch or read about. Actually, to give Dio a comparison to another series close to my heart, being Hunter x Hunter, I would be tempted to put him in a similar league to a figure like Hisoka, who is 100% a selfish, detestable existence, but the way he conducts himself with a sense of style is nothing short of completely compelling. Although in Hisoka's case, he has arguably many more humanizing figures and grey area moments than Dio would, so Dio represents more of an absolute, and he's almost like a bit of a cult leader actually. Watching or reading Dio, you know for a fact that this guy is not someone that you want to be involved with, but you can't help but go further down that rabbit hole with every word he says, and then before you know it, you've been inducted into the cult of Zawarudo, and you're now spending your entire life crafting Dio-related memes. And speaking of memes, I would be remiss not to mention that those play a role in catapulting Dio into the stratosphere of popularity, because in this day and age, memes more or less have the ability to make or break a series. And I actually attribute memes to being a key factor in JoJo's late stage success, as well as a barrier to entry, mind you, because they can get slightly out of control, and Dio is at the center of most of that behavior. So even though it was almost entirely unintentional, Araki has created a character who was very easily adopted into this modern globalized society, and the words Kono Dio da, Zawarudo, and Rodorola are somewhat ingrained into the psyche of people who are not even fans of JoJo, or actually people who aren't even fans of anime and manga in general. And that dominant meme presence of Dio also very much affects how he is viewed in the actual series, because these memes, which are very much created to generate humor, only endear us more to this demonic psychopath. So people who have experienced a lot of this come into JoJo with an immediate bias towards liking him, because we've seen him used with humorous situations on the internet, and for better or worse, I think that Dio has become just as merged with meme culture as he was with Jonathan's body. But to end on some actual substance essence of the series, Dio is probably made most prominent by his legacy on every other JoJo part. He is quite a powerful presence and arguably the reason why anything in JoJo happens at all, which is pretty obviously seen in a character like Giorno, who is part Dio, part Jonathan, or even more subtly in part 4, and with his legacy even driving the core action of part 6. And then when Araki decided to start his own alternate JoJoverse, Dio had to leave his mark there as well in the form of Diego Brando, who was a pretty fantastic incarnation of Dio, although definitely not quite as cartoonishly flamboyantly evil as his namesake, which personally I love quite a lot, and I think that Diego is the ultimate form of Dio. But all of this is what makes Dio such an incredible figure to look back on, because even if I wasn't satisfied by what he presented during his tenure of being alive, looking back on everything that was and is Dio, it becomes impossible to deny what an absurdly powerful character he is, who with every narrative feature going against him managed to pierce the heavens and become the undeniable face of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. But what do you guys think? Please do let me know in the comments below, or if you're keen for some more JoJo content, then please do go and check out some of my other videos or even subscribe to the channel for regular JoJo wonder delivered straight into your YouTube feed. But for now, this has been the New World Review, and I'll see you next time.